Let's talk a little bit about the shift that happened in Silicon Valley, okay? Because I think what happened is what's called a preference cascade. You probably know that term better than me, but it's essentially when several people, maybe a group of people, around the same time realize they're not the only one. And in fact, maybe they represent, if not a majority, a powerful minority. And I remember it very clearly because it was the day our son was born. Our son was born, and a few hours later, Trump got shot at in Butler. And I watched as people who had, all of the aesthetics had been indicating to me that they were Trump supporters, but all of a sudden, with the picture of Trump and all of them retweeting it, it became, oh my God, like abundantly clear as one after the other started to basically endorse him with this picture.
Yes.
Explain that phenomenon to me, because like me, I'm sure lots of people who have one politics on Signal or WhatsApp and another politics in public. And I felt like over the course of basically from July to the election, the gap between those things radically narrowed. Yes. What happened?
Yeah, it's probably something like what you described. There was some degree to which it was safer for people to speak out when other people were speaking out. Once, if you know you're lying and you know that everybody's lying and you know that everybody knows that everybody's lying, at some point it becomes pretty unstable and it can just all of a sudden shift pretty fast into...
Was Elon the critical ingredient? Did he give people cover?
I think Elon was incredibly important to it. I think there were a lot of pieces that had built up in Silicon Valley. There was always a way where for many years people had been doubling down on the wokeness, the political correctness inside these companies. And then it's always an ambiguous thing. If something is not working, let's say wokeness isn't really working, it's not making your employees happier and more productive and more constructive, and it's instead deranging it. But the ambiguity is, does that mean you need to have more wokeness or do you need to cut it out altogether? And for a number of years, the intuition was we just have to do a little bit more. And we have to try a little bit harder and do a little bit more. And then there's some point where it just got exhausted. And certainly a lot of the top tech founders and CEOs felt comfortable telling me this behind closed doors. And maybe they're just telling me things that I want to hear, but I tend to think they're telling me what they really think. And so I was very aware of this incredible disconnect. And it was in Silicon Valley, I think a lot of it was experienced as corporate governance, as how ridiculous it's gotten to manage these ideologically deranged millennial employees.
Did Elon Musk really become the catalyst for this shift? Or was he just the most visible representation of an undercurrent that was already brewing? It's worth asking. What happens when an industry leader decides to challenge the status quo publicly instead of behind closed doors? The ripple effect seems to show how much influence one bold stance can have.
And I'll try not to name names. One of the bigger companies that was in San Francisco, the people in 2017, the founders told me they weren't sure they could take any more money from me because I supported Trump, and it was difficult to explain to their employees. But it was about a 12-month period. By 2019, they hadn't shifted to being pro-Trump, but they really appreciated my courage. And they organized their company where they had the hiring goals were to shift employees away from San Francisco Bay Area as fast as possible. So we have X% of people working in San Francisco, and we want to reduce that percentage as quickly as possible for a company as big as we are. And then if we build our employee workforce in any place other than San Francisco, it'll be less woke and less crazy and more productive. And so this was the kind of just very prosaic conversation you had about how to manage a company. And then at some point we got the preference cascade that was 2024. But yeah, obviously Elon gave people a great deal of cover. It certainly seemed incredibly dangerous to me what he did, incredibly courageous. What would have happened to him if Trump would have lost? And then certainly it was maybe all of the rest of us can be a little bit more courageous than we otherwise were going to be. But he gave cover to everybody.
One of the things that was being said on both sides before the election by Oprah and Elon, and they sounded different saying it, but it was the same message, was that if their candidate didn't win, this was going to be the last American election. I thought that was totally nuts, but maybe you don't. Or maybe you hear it differently.
I didn't want to believe Elon when he said this. And I texted him a few weeks before the election and told him, I hadn't believed you when you said this at first. But I think it's because psychologically I don't want to believe that. I don't want to believe that the country's so far gone that you have to leave the country or something. But the sense in which I felt that he was correct was that if Trump, with what I think but much better substance, much better on so many things, could not win in 2024 against the machine.
The tension leading up to the 2024 election mirrors a deeper anxiety about the country's direction. For leaders like Elon to frame it as a potential turning point, possibly the last fair election, underscores just how polarized and high stakes the environment felt. It's not just about politics, it's about the future of American governance and culture. If nothing else, it pushed people to consider what they were willing to fight for.
The machine would always win. And if the machine always wins, you no longer have a democracy. You certainly no longer have a democratic process within the Democratic Party. We always debate the election shenanigans in November of 2020. The far more extraordinary thing was March of 2020, where Biden comes in fourth place, fifth place in Iowa, New Hampshire, and then somehow gets rammed through South Carolina. All the other candidates drop off. So it's the extremely non-democratic primary in the Democratic Party in 2020. And then an even less democratic process by which Biden was replaced with Harris. And yeah, it was going to be this. And if the machine could defeat Trump, I thought it was reasonable that it would gain even more power and somehow be unbeatable, and the country would become California, would become a one-party state. And it would be far worse than California, because the constraint on California is people can leave California. It's much harder to leave the U.S.
When you say the machine, explain what you mean by that.
It's a question of what is actually going on in the Democratic Party, or in this progressive cult that is the left. And again, maybe a cult is too kind a word, because a cult normally has a cult leader. There's at least one person who's thinking inside a cult, the cult leader. And it's a machine because there are no individuals. And it's you are just a small cog in the machine, and you're destined to become an ever smaller cog in this ever bigger machine. And that's the vibe of it. And it doesn't, ideas don't matter, debates don't matter, speech doesn't matter. It's just some kind of fast consensus formation process. We get to an answer, and then we rigorously enforce it. It's always too extreme to describe it like the Communist Party or something like this, but it's just this extremely regimented process that's somehow not very democratic, not very thoughtful, not very Republican.
Isn't it unsettling how the concept of the machine strips away individuality, reducing everything to a rigid enforced consensus? If ideas and debates no longer matter, what does that mean for democracy itself? And if this kind of system becomes the norm, how do we stop it from spreading beyond politics into every facet of society?
Not very American.
Okay. One of the things that interested me about your role in this election cycle is when you look back at 2016, you were all in, right? You gave tens of millions of dollars between Trump and then I think 16 Republican candidates, including Senator, now VP-elect J.D. Vance, who we'll get to. But you sat this presidential election cycle out, and you were at the Aspen Ideas Festival, not a place that I expect to see you. And you said this: if you hold a gun to my head, I'll vote for Trump, but I'm not going to give any money to his super PAC. Why?
The Aspen Ideas Festival, it's a 75% liberal audience. So even in front
of... It's way more than 75%. Okay. I will say when I showed up there, I was like the most right-wing person there.
If you take me literally, Barry, I'll just make this point, and you held a gun to my head in front of a liberal audience, and I would say I'm still voting for Trump, even if you hold a gun to my head in front of this very liberal audience, you better believe that I'm very pro-Trump. I also said that I didn't think the money would make that much of a difference, and it turned out really not to, right? It was Trump was insanely outspent, and it didn't matter. But yeah,
I think what I mean is you're all in 2016, and then it feels like you retreated. Other people stepped into the breach, but you retreated. And if I see a pattern to your life, and the bets you make, you're often very early and very ahead. And so I guess I wonder what that pulling back indicates.
I don't know. I articulated in various contexts why I thought Trump was going to win, why he should win, what I went on to discuss at the Aspen Ideas Festival. Probably the thing I said that was the most scandalous was just descriptively, he's going to win. He's going to win by a big margin. Because for that audience, it's always Hegelian. The actual is the ideal. And so if you say that Trump's going to win, that's the way of saying Trump should win and he deserves to win. And so the most scandalous thing I could have told those people was not, I'm going to work really hard for Trump and it may or may not succeed. The most scandalous thing I could tell them was Trump is on the winning side of history and he's going to crush it whether I help him or not. So that was the most shocking thing. And there were like audible gasps when I said that to that audience.
Could it be that stepping back and letting the results speak for themselves is sometimes more powerful than direct involvement? This approach challenges the idea that money and effort are the only ways to influence outcomes. When you predict victory with confidence, especially to an opposing audience, does it shift the narrative more than campaigning ever could?
You said in one interview in 2023 that the Trump administration was crazier and more dangerous than you expected. What do you mean by that?
It felt very unstable. It felt dangerous for the people who got involved. There were all sorts of people who got prosecuted. People went to jail. They probably did things that were wrong. They were also subject to crazy double standards. And yeah, there were aspects of it that felt a circular firing squad, where it was, I don't know, this, there were all sorts of things where it felt like there was a lot of uncompensated volatility for the people that got involved at the time. I still have some worries that I'm certain it will be much improved this time. I still worry it will not be improved by enough. Or a different way of formulating it would be that one of the paradoxes of our elections is the elections are always relativistic exercises. It's basically two candidates. Which one do you like more, or which one do you hate less? It's more negative. Which one do you hate less? And then once the election's over, we have just one president, and then that person gets put on this pedestal, and they are always found to fall way short of that standard. So elections are relativistic. After the elections, it's absolute. And so I have a worry in the back of my head that there are elements of that will repeat, that on a relative basis, Trump was greatly to be preferred to Harris. On an absolute basis, there are all these ways I expect him to fall short. In some ways, the problems are extremely difficult. They are harder than they were 8 years ago. The border issue is out of control. Maybe you need to actually deport people instead of just building a wall. And that's a far more violent, far more drastic thing to do. And the foreign policy situation is there's a crisis in Russia, Ukraine. The Iran problem's far worse than it was 8 years ago. The China-Taiwan thing. There's all these ways that it feels like the world is sleepwalking to Armageddon. I think Trump is better than Harris. Is he good enough to stop us from Armageddon? I hope so.
The volatility of Trump's first term underscores a broader issue, the immense difficulty of governing in today's polarized environment. With escalating global crises and domestic challenges, the demands of leadership are almost insurmountable. While Trump might be the preferable option in a relative sense, the absolute difficulties ahead are daunting for any administration.
Not 100% sure that he's good enough.
One of the, I think, very proper fears of those that oppose Trump was the fact that in the first administration, he had a lot of people around him who perhaps some on the right would view them as swamp creatures, but perhaps other people, me included, would view them as public servants that were trying to keep this thing on the rails, many of whom were burned or fired on Twitter or suffered, as you said, reputational damage, things like that. And the idea is like he's burned through the A list, the B list, the C list, and who's left. Do you share that fear? Do you think that's well-founded?
Not at all.
Really? Okay.
I don't know. I think they'll have a much stronger bench this time. I think a lot of the, let's say establishmentarian swamp creature people they ended up with were not that good. I don't know. And I don't want to pick on too many individually, but someone like General Mattis at Defense, as the defense secretary, how bad your people skills have to be that you fall for the Elizabeth Holmes Theranos fraud and you're on the board of her company. And
George
one
Shultz fell for that too, to be fair. And I don't think you consider him a...
He was a lot older. I expect a general, there are probably ways they're too regimented. I expect them to have good skills at judging people and leading people. And there aren't that many frauds in Silicon Valley that you fall for the biggest one in the last decade. Maybe FTX.
I just don't know if that's the fair litmus. Rupert Murdoch fell for it too.
He invested in it. He was not on the board. But I think there were all these ways. I don't think these people were that good, and they were not good at rethinking some of the priorities. And I don't think there are ways that Trump does not have a overarching ideological agenda. It's not Reaganite. It's not a programmatic agenda, but there is a direction that the neocon interventionism went wrong.
The critique of figures like General Mattis reflects a broader issue: the gap between traditional expertise and the demands of modern leadership. Trump's departure from programmatic agendas opens the door for a different kind of team, one potentially more agile and less constrained by outdated paradigms. This could prove to be an asset, not a liability.
It needs to be we need to rethink the failures of especially the Bush Republican era. There's a sense that the globalization project has gone very haywire. And again, it's not clear what you do instead. And there's a part of globalization in theory. It was a good thing, a borderless world, a world in which there are no boundaries to trade, the movement of goods, immigration, the movement of people, capital, the movement of finance and the power of banks, and ideas, the free flow of information, the internet. This was globalization in theory, and then in practice, so much of it somehow got hijacked by corrupt actors that are adversarial to the U.S. The WTO is a free trade organization that by 2001 was hijacked by communist China. And then there is some way the stuff needed to be rethought. And again, Trump, I don't think had a great ideology on this, but directionally, I believe he was correct that we needed to somehow rethink these things. And the place where the swamp preachers were very unhelpful is they didn't want to rethink things. They did not. And I do think this is where the second Trump administration will be in a different place.
Trump's almost 80 years old. He's not going to change his character and who he is. And if you're someone, let's say, who has a great life, maybe you're in Silicon Valley, maybe you're looking and thinking, wait, wow, maybe I could make a big difference in this administration, and you just see the way that he churns through people. What's going to make you overcome that, this theoretical person, to decide to move to Washington, D.C. and give it a shot? I just don't see that aspect of it changing.
I don't think Trump is going to change his views that strongly. But again, I don't think he's that
I mean his character, not his views, his character.
But I think he was right to fire. They were wrong to hire a lot of the people they hired. They were right to fire a lot of them because they were not aligned. They were not remotely aligned with the administration. There's some way to do it, and there's some way not to do it.
The failures of globalization reflect how an idealistic framework can be exploited when accountability is weak. Trump's instinct to challenge these dynamics, even without a detailed ideology, was a necessary course correction. For a second term, assembling a team aligned with this vision will be crucial, especially to navigate entrenched resistance.
I don't want to pick on too many individuals, but Bolton as National Security Advisor, he was picked because he agreed with Trump on one thing, which was that Iran was a problem. And he disagreed with Trump on everything else. And
China?
And I think Bolton didn't have a terribly well-formed set of views on China, and it was not a priority. So he probably disagreed with it as a priority, if nothing else. And then, maybe Trump should have known this and should not have hired Bolton, or Bolton should have been aware of it and should have been able to figure out a way to work within the rough direction that had been set by Trump, and it just blew up. My hope is there will be way fewer firings. They'll do a better job the first time around.
In 2016, you had a hand in suggesting candidates for Trump's administration. Vanity Fair, which I'm sure you don't read, called you the shadow president. Who's in that role this time? Some people see Elon Musk camped out at Mar-a-Lago and saying it's him. Other people are watching as potential appointees like Bridge Colby are making their way to pilgrimage in Tucker Carlson's house in Maine. Is it him that's calling the shots? Who are the people that are most influential in Trump's ear right now?
I think Trump is calling the shots. I think President Trump is calling the shots. He's probably thought about it a lot more than he did when he came in 2016. I'm not sure he'll get everything right, but I think he is going to be much more focused on bringing in people that are roughly in sync with the program. And I'm hopeful it'll be off to a much better start. But I think at the end of the day, the buck stops with Trump. And this is a way where it is very different from Biden or whatever the last 4 years that we just had were.
Isn't it refreshing to hear someone say that Trump is the one truly in charge this time around? There's a tendency to view power as being held by others behind the scenes. But Trump's leadership in 2024 will likely be more deliberate. With the experience he's gained since 2016, the real question is how he'll balance bringing in the right people without losing his edge.